So I want to give an overview of the immune system with this video, and I'm predominantly going to focus on innate immunity and turn your attention to a different video to hone in on adaptive, also known as specific immunity. Now, one of the things that I think really differentiates this chapter from virtually every other chapter we cover in anatomy and physiology is that this is very much a functional based system and less so of an organ based system. So we have cells that are going to be the key players. We have mucous membranes that in some cases are going to be the key players. And we're really stepping away from that organ based system. So just to highlight a few stars of the show here, this is a dendritic cell that's going to play a key role in our innate defenses. And you can see here, so dendrites, think about those extensions coming from a nerve cell, right? And so the extensions in these dendritic cells, in this case, are grabbing rods of bacteria. So those are pretty cool. Who can't appreciate this, right? Who doesn't have somebody close to them that's been impacted by cancer? But what you're seeing here is a cytotoxic T cell. So this is going to be one of the key players in your specific or adaptive immunity. And these cytotoxic T cells have the ability to go on direct cellular attack of cells, including cancer cells. So that's what's captured here in a scanning electron micrograph image of that work. And then just to bear in mind big picture terminology here. So what you see here are antibodies with very specific ends that are going to be latching on to antigens. I love thinking about the origin of this word antigen. So if you break it up, it really stands for antibody generating. So an antigen is typically going to be something that's foreign, a foreign invader that we are then going to mount a response to. Now we will see something called self-antigen. So I'll look at MHC protein and their roles in our immune system. But the majority of antigens that we refer to, particularly in this video, are going to be foreign in nature. And so these antibodies we can generate in response to one of those foreign invaders to help us mount an attack to them. So goals for this video, what are the key cells that are going to be involved in innate immunity? What are some of the features that we're going to see that are also going to be involved in innate immunity? And keeping the big picture in mind, can you then contrast these innate defenses from adaptive or specific defenses? I'll touch upon that at the end of this video, but again, I've got that separate video that looks at specific immunity. So here we go. All right, so overviewing these different lines of defense. You may have heard this analogy before, but I love it, and it's one that's really sunk in with me. So with your innate defenses, so this is going to include what we call our first line of defense, so our first protective mechanism, as well as our second. So our first lines of defense are going to be like the moat around our castle. It's going to be like the castle walls. So these are going to be those surface barriers that are going to be present no matter who is trying to get into the castle. Okay, so second line of defense, these are still going to be non-specific defenses. And I like thinking about our innate defenses as soldiers, but maybe not very intelligent soldiers. So they are just going to attack anybody who breaches our moat, who comes in our castle, right? We're going to have these teams of forces that are going to just attack anybody who comes through. And then for our third line of defense, these are like our case officers. These are like our spies who are going to mount a highly intelligent, highly specific attack to invaders. And we're going to see that a key distinction between innate defenses and these adaptive defenses is that with these adaptive defenses, we can harbor memory. So we're going to be able to develop memory cells that will help us to attack that antigen if we should counter it again at a later date. Okay, so that's just one preview of a key distinction between these two branches of immunity. So let's take a closer look at this first line of defense and give a little bit more consideration, I should say, to surface barriers that we have in the body. Okay, so innate defenses, the castle walls, the moat surrounding our castle, these are our surface barriers. But I want you to appreciate that it's not just physical defenses, but also chemical defenses, also tissue level defenses. So our skin is a fantastic example of a surface barrier. And if you think about most infections in the body, most of the time when we get sick, it's coming, those germs, those antigens are permeating through our body through places where we don't have skin, right? Think about COVID right now, right? Respiratory contact seems to be the main way that it's contracted. Just common cold, common flu, right? Touching your face, mucous membranes, eyes, right? Places where we are lacking skin, STDs, right? So in addition to skin, and skin is arguably one of the most important parts of our immune system. I think that case could be made. You can certainly also appreciate that in the cases of severe burns where infection is of great risk. Mucous membranes, as well as their secretions. So these are cilia in our trachea that you're seeing here. And if you think about the pseudo-stratified, ciliated, columnar epithelium that lines our trachea, that epithelium also has goblet cells that are going to secrete mucus. And that mucus, in working with the cilia, are able to capture and trap bacteria. And we ultimately swallow that, and our stomach acid then deals with that. So we've seen that before in the digestive system. So one more note on the skin. So our sebaceous glands that are affiliated with our hair follicles. If you recall from previous classes, that those sebaceous glands secrete a slightly acidic oil. And that oil can be referred to as our acid mantle. So a pH that sits below neutral for sure, that can assist in combating or battling bacteria. So there's more. If you think about other places in the body, right? So I alluded to the eyes a little bit ago, right? So our tears, right, contain lysozymes. So just the moisture that we have on our eyes, that's constantly secreted from those lacrimal glands, right? That fluid contains lysozymes that can also fight bacteria. Earwax is another nice example of this first line of defense, this innate immunity that we're born with. I didn't pause to really elaborate on that term, innate. But if you think about what that means, that means that it's something that we're born with. That's something that we don't have to come into contact with something foreign in order to make tears, or in order to make earwax, or in order to have these beautiful cilia in our trachea that help us to clean our air, right? We don't have to get sick to develop those. We are born with them, and they're part of our natural protection to foreign invaders. So let's say that our first line of defense has been breached, right? Our castle walls are broken, and we're going to take the example of a deadly mutant splinter in this case. Okay, something like this can carry bacteria, and once it crosses the walls of our skin, we are going to have a second team of defenses that are on hand, ready to go. So what do these forces look like? So our soldiers, right? So things to bear in mind. I described them as being non-intelligent before, maybe not the smartest soldiers around, because their defenses, their attack is non-specific in nature. So perhaps our analogy fails a little bit here, but we're going to run with it. The fact that it's a rapid response works great with this analogy, right? These soldiers are there all the time, ready to go. Okay, so if you think about our dermis, right? Again, thinking back to previous classes, to 201, that integumentary system, in the dermis, we have areolar connective tissue. And in that loose connective tissue, you have all sorts of cells that are part of your second line of defense that are patrolling in that area. So they're going to be ready to go. You're going to have macrophages. You're going to have some phagocytes, right? Well, macrophages are a type of phagocyte. So here are the parts of our second line of defense that I want to highlight here. So phagocytes, what are called natural killer cells, what a great name that is. Our inflammatory response is considered to be a second line of defense, as is fever. So with these phagocytes, right, so phage means to eat. So phagocytosis, the hug of death, that cartoon made me smile. We have to get our kicks where we can, right? So phagocytes, so neutrophils. So if you think about our leukocytes, right, in the chapter on the blood, and the mnemonic that you can use to remember which of those leukocytes are most prominent. So never let monkeys eat bananas. So the N for never represents the neutrophils, right? So these are the most abundant of those white blood cells. So here's this sometimes a bilobed nucleus. They are among the granulocytic white blood cells, leukocytes, right? So our neutrophils, and they actually become phagocytic once they're exposed to infectious bacteria. You can think about our neutrophils as being our first responders, and we're going to see an example of that in just a second here. So macrophages in general, literally meaning big macrophage eaters. So very robust cells. You have both free as well as fixed macrophages. And just to give you a little taste of what that may look like, so not so long ago in the respiratory chapter, right, these green cells here, nope, it was these kind of purplish blue cells. Those were representing macrophages that were down at the level of our alveoli. So those are going to be a nice example of fixed macrophages that aren't rotating or swimming in our blood, but that rather are going to be omnipresent in those alveoli. Another cool example of some of these macrophages, a cool picture that came from a Nature review back in 2014, but if you remember our choroid plexus, this is a place where we make cerebral spinal fluid. So what you're seeing here are those specialized glial cells in the central nervous system and a macrophage, a choroid plexus macrophage. So you're going to have some macrophages right at the start of where our cerebral spinal fluid is made. It makes such sense, right? We're going to want to ensure that we don't have bacterial populations that could be entering our cerebral spinal fluid and then passing through our spinal cord. Here you see, so perivascular, so around the vasculature. Again, we're dealing with the central nervous system here. So this is a macrophage that is going to be present in the CNS. So again, just some examples to help you appreciate how widespread these are and some of the roles that they play in the body. So coming back to this idea of a splinter breaching our skin, right? So crossing over the stratum corneum of our epidermis, going into the dermis. And again, in this region, you are going to have cells of our immune system that are going to be ready to respond. So what you're generally seeing here is frankly a bit of a simplification. It's oversimplified for sure, but I think it helps you to appreciate how we can mobilize phagocytes, how we may be able to get neutrophils that are swimming around in our capillaries to the site of injury, to this site where the splinter has crossed through our skin. So looking at the chain of events here, so we can see tissue damage is going to carry bacteria into the wound, right? You could also think about stepping on a nail, right? And when those cells are wounded, they're going to release chemicals. So that's shown here in red. This is a process called chemotaxis. So chemochemistry, chemicals, and then taxis, right? You could think about a taxi traveling. So this is a field of chemicals that are going to be released that are then going to serve to stimulate, among other cells, mast cells that would be in the dermis. Okay, and what these mast cells can do is they release histamine. Histamine is something that we are very familiar with regard to seasonal allergies or allergic responses. And one of the things that histamine does is it is going to increase capillary permeability. So these capillaries, right? So they are only wide enough for one, maybe two red blood cells to pass at a time. So they are very thin. And when you have this histamine released, it is going to allow for cells such as neutrophils to leave the bloodstream and enter the site of injury. So this is something that is unique to white blood cells. Leukocytes can leave the capillaries and find their targets outside of our bloodstream. Well, it's a really cool process when you think about that. Red blood cells don't have that capability, right? Sure, you can bleed, but they're not specifically targeting anything, whereas these neutrophils are. I also like this picture because in this image, you can see the neutrophil wrapping around bacteria. And so we are witnessing a neutrophil becoming phagocytic upon contact. Now, this process of a neutrophil leaving the capillaries is called diapedesis. I encourage you to play this video. So this link is live and it will take you to a beautifully constructed video that walks you through the immune response. And it walks you through a scenario where the first and second line of defenses have failed. And we then see the body, in some sense, trying to decide which branch of adaptive or specific immunity needs to be called upon next. There's also a beautiful example of diapedesis that's shown in that video, so I highly recommend this. It's also posted to our course show. So while that last image was really focusing in on the initial stages that would trigger a neutrophil to leave the bloodstream, that would cause it to leave the capillary, that is also at the core of the acute inflammatory response. This is something we're all familiar with, right? Some of the cardinal signs: redness, heat, swelling, and pain. And if you think simply, if nothing else, if you only think about that process that I just showed with increased capillary permeability, that explains a number of these cardinal symptoms right off the bat. So increased capillary permeability, you're going to have more blood reaching the site of injury, which is going to cause redness. It's also going to cause heat, right? And the pain that is triggered with acute inflammation is really caused from the swelling. So you have more cells arriving to a site of injury to help with tissue repair, to help with cleanup, if you want to think about it in those terms. But that swelling can press on mechanoreceptors, right? And so that compression on receptors in our skin and elsewhere in the body, that's really what creates the pain. So some of the benefits of the acute inflammatory response. So it's going to prevent the spread of damage. So as fast as possible, we are trying to get to the site of injury and prevent it from going outside of that site of injury. We're also going to see that we can dispose of cell debris and pathogens here, right? A key role of those macrophages and phagocytes. It's going to set the stage for repair, right? Getting all those leukocytes to the site of injury. And in some cases, it will alert the adaptive immune system. So that specific line of defense, that third line of defenses. And so there's certainly interplay across these systems that would occur in a real situation. This process and thinking about the benefits of the acute inflammatory response begs the question of, should we continue to ice, right, injuries? So an ankle sprain, should we ice it? If you think about what's at the core of icing an injury, right, what it's doing is it's reducing the redness, it's reducing the heat, it's reducing the swelling. And ultimately what we're working to do is to reduce the pain, right? But in reducing all of those things, are we not also making it more difficult for the body to prevent the spread of damage? Are we as efficient at disposing of cell debris and pathogens? I know that myself, when I have an acute sports injury, I am increasingly of the mindset that I don't ice it, and I let it run its course. But for more serious things, such as a surgery that somebody might go under for, I think there would certainly be an argument to be made, no doubt, that some icing would be beneficial. So coming back to these four factors, and there's more, these are the ones that I'm really choosing to highlight for you all that I'd like you to know. So we've talked about this phagocytic cells. We've looked at this inflammatory response. Now I want to talk about these natural killer cells briefly, as well as fever. So these natural killer cells in cellular cartoons, that is a thing, they're often portrayed as police officers, right? He's got the little NK hat on. He's saying the cell isn't right. I must destroy it quickly before it releases a bunch of new viruses. So one of the themes I've tried to impress upon you all with this innate immunity is that it's non-specific. Definitely doesn't form memory cells. But you may be questioning, okay, well, this police officer, this NK cell, does seem to be able to at least distinguish self from non-self. And that is the case, but that's about as far as they can go. So they can distinguish a cell that is one of our own from a cell that is a foreign invader. And they do that because they can recognize what are called MHC, major histocompatibility complex. I know that's a mouthful, but these are just really specific proteins. These MHC surface receptors have specificity to them. And that specificity is unique to you. And it allows these NK cells to say, hey, this is foreign, I should attack, or this is one of my own, I'm going to let it be. But again, just to reiterate, even though they do have a bit of specificity, you're definitely not getting any memory cells from these natural killer cells. So we have found that NK cells have the ability to kill cells that have been infected by a virus or cells that have been infected by cancer. And what they do is they actually kill by inducing apoptosis in that cell. So they're not phagocytic. They're not directly engulfing a foreign invader or a cancer cell or a virus infected cell, but rather they are inducing apoptosis in that cell. That is really all I'm expecting you to know about natural killer cells. That said, this is a fascinating area of immunity, and there's so much more that these cells can do, so many more areas of research that we're seeing right now, both with cancer and viruses that you might be interested, especially if you're taking micro right now, that you might be interested in learning a little bit more about. Another video here that you may want to click on that does a nice job of talking about natural killer cells' role in something like a tissue graft as one example that's given. Okay, so fever. This is the last of the mechanisms that I wanted to highlight with this second line of defense. So we're still dealing, again, with innate defenses. Fever looks the same no matter what you are fighting. Right? So a fever is a fever. It's this elevated body temperature. It's a systemic response to invading microorganisms. So if you think about what's really going on, so we've learned that macrophages can release pyrogens. So pyro, you may be thinking like pyromaniac, right? Run with that. So these pyrogens, what they do is they trigger the hypothalamus, right? A key part of our brain that's involved in temperature homeostasis. And they trigger the hypothalamus to increase our body temperature. So pretty slick. So what are the benefits? Right, I think similar arguments can be made here with fever as they can with whether or not to ice an injury. There is some debate now, no doubt, about whether or not you should take Tylenol or Advil or medicine to suppress a low-grade fever, right? And I think the consensus may increasingly be that a low-grade fever should maybe run its course. Now, if you're dealing with a young one, or if you're dealing with particularly high fevers, then that decision becomes a little bit more nuanced, right? I don't think many people would argue that a fever of 104, 105 should definitely be treated, but a fever of 101, maybe let it run its course. So what are these benefits? It increases our metabolic rate, right? So we had, not so long ago, we looked at the endocrine system, right? And we were looking at the role of thyroid hormone. And one of the things that comes to mind here is with individuals who suffer from hyperthyroidism, or an elevated metabolism, their body temperature is also hot. They're often very warm, whereas somebody with hypothyroidism often feels very cold. So run with that line of thinking here. And one of the huge benefits of increasing our body temperature is it does increase metabolic rates, which in turn is then going to just speed up defensive actions in a very general sense throughout our body. Another thing that we've learned about fever is that it helps the spleen and the liver to sequester iron and zinc, which microorganisms need to survive. So that's another interesting benefit that we've seen. And I've got the canon here. Going back to our analogy, I think about the fever as, our first line of defense failed. Our second line of defense isn't cutting it. So we're going to bring in the big guns here with a system-wide fever, elevation of body temperature, to see if we can kick this foreign invader, to see if we can mount a more effective response to whatever antigen that body is dealing with. All right, so that is all I wanted to say about these innate defenses, right? We talked about these surface barriers, skin, mucous membranes, right? The pH of the skin, the goblet cells and cilia that are going to be involved in mucous membranes, these internal defenses, right? So we talked about that. With these adaptive defenses, again, these are our special ops team, right? Our higher intelligence of our immune system that is then going to come on the scene. And so the other video that I've posted really draws some key contrast between humoral immunity, where the B cells and their progeny are going to shine, whereas with cellular immunity, it's going to be the T cells, the helper T cells, the cytotoxic T cells. One more note with the humoral immunity, the end goal of humoral immunity is not only producing memory cells, but this is where the antibodies are going to reside as well. So you've got antibodies stemming from this branch, and you've got our cytotoxic T cells, our helper T cells, our memory T cells coming from this branch. But I want to keep things pretty big picture still for this video. So I want to talk a little bit more about general contrast that we see with specific defenses. Okay, if you think about some of the key qualities of the adaptive immunity. So I've emphasized this quite a bit already. We have a memory here. We don't see that with innate immunity. It is highly specific, highly targeted, right? Think about the specific ends of antibodies, right? We are no longer dealing with just these generic responses that are going to be the same no matter who crosses our castle walls, right? Our natural killer cells attack the same no matter who they're attacking. Our skin, our mucous membranes, they are going to give the exact same response every time. You do not see that with this adaptive or specific lines of immunity. Here, you also are going to see that we have a systemic response. Something like inflammation that we saw before was definitely going to be highly localized. That was one of the key goals of inflammation, right? Was to ensure that it doesn't spread, that it doesn't become systemic. We wanted to contain that infection so it doesn't spread. This we also have not seen, and this lies at the core of adaptive immunity. So the adaptive system must first be primed. And what that means is simply that it has to initially be exposed to some sort of a pathogen, to some sort of foreign substance, before it can figure out what it needs to do, okay? And that is not something we saw with those built-in innate defenses that were there all the time, ready to go. So what are these things that are going to trigger adaptive immunity? Again, antigens, right? So antibody generating. So an antigen can be defined as substances that can mobilize adaptive defenses and provoke an immune response. So usually it is the case that these are intruder molecules that you don't find in the body. But again, those MHC molecules are an example of self-antigen that allows our body to distinguish our own team, self, from non-self, foreign invaders. So what you're simply seeing here is a pathogen. These antibodies need to be made to be able to lock and key, right, to specifically bond to a square-shaped antigen in this case, whereas this antibody has no problem binding to this particular antigen. So just to reiterate this idea of specificity and to get you linking antibodies with antigens. So coming back to our learning objectives here, right? So can you stop the video now and recall some of the key features of the first line of defense, some of the key cells and players of the second line of defense? And could you potentially do a compare contrast of innate defenses from adaptive defenses? And I encourage you to try to do that from memory, right? Close your notes, see if you can recreate kind of a compare and contrast of those two branches of immunity. You're going to draw a blank, but that's a good time to go back and revisit your notes, revisit key points from this video. But test yourself now as this video winds down to see how much you retain right off the bat.